Have you ever wondered if Willy Wonka existed in real life? Did everything we saw in the 3 movies really happen? Who was the factory inherited by? Stay tuned, friends, because you'll be amazed at the true and tragic history behind this great chocolatier. All the adaptations we have today of Willy Wonka or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory originated from a book by the author Roald Dahl. This book practically has everything we see in the movies, but the interesting part is the inspiration behind for the creation of this crazy story. You see, Roald had many experiences as a child that will sound very familiar to us. When Roald Dahl was just a little boy, he remembers that during his school days, it was common for chocolate companies to send packages with chocolate bars. This was so that the children could taste these bars and say why they liked them and not others. In those times, this was the method they used to test their products and improve them in the market. But a surprising truth shocked him for the rest of his life. Shortly after, Dahl learned the real reason why factories did this, specifically in schools with children. It might sound like a very normal practice, right? Having your main customers tell you what to do to improve. Well, no. The truth was that they did this because they didn't want to hire adults so they wouldn't steal the recipes for their chocolates. Exactly, friends. What we saw in the movies with Willy Wonka did happen in real life. This was the easiest way to get a recipe for a successful company. Roald was traumatized by this. He practically couldn't sleep with this idea in mind. His obsession with all things chocolate was so great that while he was at school, he imagined himself becoming the best chocolatier in the world. He created unmatched recipes and thousands of candies that would revolutionize the industry. Such was the imagination of this child that by then he had already thought of interesting inventions like those we saw in the movies, such as chocolate eggs, edible grass, and of course, the classic everlasting gobstopper. It wasn't until several years later that he started writing down all these occurrences in his book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where he created the character of Willy Wonka, in whom he saw himself. Sounds like a very simple story for the creation of such an iconic character, doesn't it? But what if I told you that there is a real-life Willy Wonka?
Don't ask. Just enjoy.
In fact, he existed long before this book was written. And the interesting thing is that the author, Roald Dahl, didn't even know this person existed. I'm talking about Charlie Sigvarsson, who has even mentioned that he's better than Willy Wonka himself. But why? Well, in fact, his story is very similar to what we see of Willy Wonka in the movies, especially the one that has just been released. And I repeat, this man existed long before the book was written. His childhood was not the best, to say the least. As a child, he lacked many things. He couldn't even buy a single piece of candy, because that meant deducting from the little money his family had to be able to eat. And this poverty was because Charlie was born just after World War II, and his family was in extreme poverty. Exactly, just like we saw in the movie. But unlike fiction, here Charlie did not receive a golden ticket to attend a great factory. One could say that his golden ticket was going to school to study marketing. At school, he was a great student. He always had the highest grades. And in college, a great opportunity opened up for him, as he had to study several local companies for his thesis. Of all of the options presented to him, only 2 caught his attention the most: an ice cream shop and a chocolate factory. And we already know which one he chose. Due to his excellent talent, Charlie soon became the manager of this chocolate shop called Pauline Johnson. And in fact, over time, he developed a great passion for candies. So much so that he ended up investing all his money in shares for this company, which would ruin his life. All this continued until he turned 40 years old. At that time, the company's president had died. This caused shareholders to lose interest in Pauline Johnson, and therefore the company went bankrupt. And all this seemed like the worst thing that had happened in Charlie's life, since with this failure, he was left with nothing. All his money invested all those years simply disappeared, and he stayed for a long time without money, living in the same scarcity as he did in his childhood. But it wasn't until a few weeks later that one of his friends contacted him to work in a bakery. It was the biggest opportunity Charlie was going to have at this moment, so he didn't hesitate and partnered with his friend. The interesting thing is that Charlie always had a passion and desire to have his own candies. His obsession with candies was so great that he began to investigate and learn to be able to create them, thus becoming a very famous chocolatier. Months later, his friends Tony and Charlie opened up 2 candy stores, which they called the Chocolate Factory. Sounds like a great coincidence that this story is called the same as the Willy Wonka book, and even that this man has the same name as the protagonist. But until this moment, Charlie had no idea that there was even a movie that told almost exactly his story. And in fact, Charlie himself has said that he's better than Willy Wonka himself, because he does have his own chocolate river. And yes, friends, it's real chocolate. Too curious, don't you think? Even this man also has almost the same eccentric personality as Willy Wonka. He dresses like him and also had a very tough childhood. Is it possible that he really didn't know about the creation of the book and the movie? Or is he just lying to gain more attention? And although many are convinced that this story would be the real story of Willy Wonka, others disagree and claim that the real Willy Wonka is Brian Solitt, the chocolate genius who invented the mint chocolate that we all love. Do you want to know the story of this other real-life Willy Wonka? Well, comment below #Wonka if you are enjoying the video. Like Charlie in the previous story, Brian was also born in those World War II times. As a child, he suffered a lot economically, and it was almost impossible to find candy at that time because of the war that was going on. But after this terrible experience, he went to work at the British chocolate factory Roundtree, where all his dreams would come true. He entered the company as a simple employee who was responsible for something very basic, pouring chocolate into molds. But his great intellect led him to discover a millionaire candy. The company had the idea of creating a candy that was chocolate on the outside and mint on the inside, but they always failed because the mint ruined the chocolate. So they gave Brian a huge challenge, which would probably cost him his job. So Brian did not allow himself to fail and managed to create the perfect formula for this chocolate, which turned out to be very successful. The company saw the great talent that this man had and made him head of the division, who was now in charge of researching and testing recipes to turn them into the next revolutionary candies. So, he was solely responsible for inventing new candies. He could even spend hours in front of his spatula trying to create the next great invention. Very similar to how Willy Wonka is in the movies. And although Brian died in 2006, many remember him as the real-life Willy Wonka. But how similar are these stories to the movies and the book? Well, friends, both in real life and his fictional story, Wonka's life has always been very tragic. Whether because he was not understood by his parents, because how hard it was for him to have his factory, or growing up in extreme poverty. In the book, Wonka's past is not mentioned or made clear. It wasn't until the 1971 movie that we really saw what happened to poor Willy for him to become a great chocolatier. He had a very strict father who didn't allow him to eat sweets or any sugar, and thanks to this, Wonka decided to become the owner of the best chocolate factory in the world, thus defying his father's rules. The same idea was included in Tim Burton's 2005 movie, where we saw several flashbacks of what his father did to Wonka, as he deprived him of any sweets and even burnt all the sweets they gave him in front of his face. This left Wonka with various traumas and a certain hatred for his father, as he never wanted to support him. Willy Wonka was very poor, and he had nothing to build his factory with, but what he did have was a lot of optimism and confidence in himself, because he also had to fight with all those companies that tried to steal the formula for his chocolates, something that did not happen to the real-life Willy Wonkas. But what they do share is that long path of struggle and effort to be who they are. So, as we can see, Willy Wonka's story is not at all fiction as it seems. Several events did happen in real life. We could even say that they were worse than in the movies. But what do you think of the incredible story of Willy Wonka? Let's discuss it in the comments.